So welcome to today's webinar series. My name is Niall. I'm a green infrastructure consultant for ANS Global. And today our very special guest is Professor Ross Cameron of Sheffield University. So as I said, Ross is based in Sheffield in the Department of Landscape Architecture. He has a degree in horticulture and a PhD in plant cold tolerance. Ross leads a team of 2 postdoctors and 10 PhD students investigating the impacts of climate and landscape plants and the value of landscape plants to people. This includes the ability to modify temperatures, provide cooling to buildings, improve air quality, modified stormwater flow, and provide health benefits to humans. Ross advised on the UK government on the benefits of green infrastructure and sits on the Royal Horticultural Society Science Committee. So Ross, that is a very great introduction, and I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Great, yeah.
So I was hoping today we could have a quick discussion about air quality, and we look at green infrastructure and how green infrastructure can play a role to help combat some of the issues we deal with in the built environment. So I know you've done a lot of studies into air quality, but could you give a kind of a quick overview about air pollution? Like, what does it really mean at street level, and what sort of percentages are we looking that, maybe is adversely affecting our health?
Yeah, well, it's in some ways it's a kind of silent killer. It's poor air quality. We think about 7 million people die every year globally due to poor air quality, and largely to some extent that's traffic issues in the developed world, but also wood stoves and things like that in the developing world. So there's various sources of where poor quality air is generated from. I think in terms of sort of everyday exposure, for most of us, it's at street level. It's in the city centres where you have that idling traffic. But if you ever notice the government sort of statistics, it varies quite a lot depending on the time of year and the type of weather we have. So it isn't a sort of constant pressure, where it can be kind of particularly bad in things like November, those cold, foggy mornings when the air doesn't disperse.
Right. And would that be, I noticed over the last, we go back a week or two ago, we had that really very hot weekend. From Sunday, when we were 30 degrees, you could see the haze in the sky. So I'm assuming there become airborne particulates. Is that because the weather was so dry that these particulates become airborne?
Yeah, well, there's gases and particulates. So that smog you sometimes see can be both gases and small particle matter. And you're quite right to kind of mention the hot weather, because different pollutants become more prevalent under different conditions. So ozone, for example, which is toxic to us in high concentrations, that forms when we have high sunlight, high solar radiation, and certain pollutants interact, ozone interacts in the atmosphere, and it increases its concentration. So it's not a simple picture. Different weathers, different conditions kind of accelerate and enhance different types of pollutants. So as I say, nitrous dioxides, for example, might be worse in winter, but ozone worse in hot days in summer.
Okay, that's really interesting. Now, because we would have spoken at various times over the years, as I mentioned within your introduction, that you've carried out various studies over the years regarding to specific types of plants, specific types of foliage, and how they can be used to help combat issues with air pollution. Would you like to kind of elaborate a little bit more on some of those studies?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just me. There's quite a lot of research going on in different parts of the world on air quality. Both indoors and outdoors, and again, the profile of different pollutants varies slightly on that spectrum. But if we're talking about outdoor street level situations, then primarily the benefits that are coming from plants are twofold. Some of these materials are absorbed by the plants and actually used by them. So nitrous dioxide can be part of the plant's ability to acquire nitrogen. So there's an absorption into the plant. And then sometimes it's more of a physical effect. It's the fact that we get this rough surface, this magnificent rough surface if we have leaves or a green wall sort of thing. And it's just a kind of filtering process. It just traps the particles and holds them and just kind of pulls them out of the atmosphere from that effect. So there's a kind of physical capture and then also a biological degradation that comes through the plants.
So I suppose if we were, I know it's not all mutually exclusive, But when we look at combating air pollution, now I know planting can never alleviate these issues completely. We have to change in the way we operate on a day-to-day basis. But we, from your studies and from various studies around the world, we know that introducing certain types of planting in specific locations can be beneficial. So is it more the argument that to absorb the gases, the nitric oxides, the carbons and so on, we want more woodier plants within the built environment, more trees, shrubs? Or
no, I don't think it's as simple as that. I think different plants, again, it's a complexity, but different plants have different attributes. So fast-growing plants are probably the ones that are going to capture carbon dioxide and nitrous oxides better because they're growing and they need it. But when we actually talk about the physical particles, then it's things like the leaf roughness, or the amount of hairs on the leaf. This fineness of the leaves, so things like conifer needles, so scales and conifers are really good. And to some extent the waxy surface, which acts a bit like a sort of sticking plaster to pull particles off the atmosphere. So the plants are largely working in two different ways. One is sort of a sticky adherence, and the other one is a kind of fine filtering, which the hairs work at. So generally speaking, plants that are hairier or stickier tend to be that bit better, certainly for the particular matter.
And is it possible then that actually a leaf analysis could be done on these plants to identify levels of particulates which would have acquired over a certain period of time?
Yeah, levels of particulates, but also that they trap different sizes. So Maria Bermudez, who did the PhD with us on the school in Sheffield, she looked at different leaf under the microscope. And you would find that, for example, ivy was pulling out a certain size of particle, yet something like bamboo may be a slightly different particle size. So this idea of a sort of complementary group of plants, I think, is quite important to give you the maximum sort of filtering effect.
So if we took a town, a city, how can we start to plan for the future? What sort of steps can we take with green infrastructure to be able to place these items within the best location? Because there's never a straight answer. There's never an easy answer. There's many environmental factors which we have to consider. And I suppose one of those factors would be wind and wind movement across the city. We also have the street canyon effect.
Yeah.
So when it comes into planning, and I know that because you've spoken at government level, do people take this approach? It's not something we would have seen in the past. Because what we've seen is it's individual buildings which make up an area, and we would have clients in individual buildings. But should there be the foresight at government level, at council level, to say these are the prevailing winds and these are the installations to include in certain areas to allow these, for the best benefits which can be received? Is this something you've ever been involved in?
I think the local element's quite important. So you do need to understand the dynamics at local levels, because wind does get diverted by buildings, and you already mentioned the canyon effect. So you get sort of air trapped sometimes by the planning process. So I actually think it is probably certainly at sort of small neighbourhood, individual building level, we probably have to look, not least because in our cities the major source is probably still traffic, vehicle exhausts. So we need to kind of get a map of typical profiles. And what's been happening in Sheffield is we've got to understanding the local issues and the hotspots, as it were, across the city, to target them for green infrastructure and also things like traffic changes and traffic flows. So I think it's not necessarily at a city scale. It's a smaller scale than that, but you need to know where the source is, and then the plants are used as the blocking mechanism. And the key thing here is to work with architects and landscape architects to make sure that the air isn't being trapped in the wrong side of the pavement. It's actually being diverted away from where the people are. And so things like green walls are a good filter, and they'll act as a general filter. But obviously with things like the canyon effect, we don't want to trap air into dead zones. So things like heavy tree canopies can be a disadvantage. But it's at that level, I think, now.
Yeah, so this is something I would have seen before, and what you said there about trapped air, because and I do just bring this up in my presentations where I show two images. One image is a busy road, we've got trees on both sides. Yeah, it looks very pretty. We have the canopy over our head, and the other image is individual columnar plants. So I'd normally ask people to make the selection, which one would you think is more applicable? And you'd be surprised the amount of people who would prefer the canopy overhead. They believe that this is a protectant, when it can actually be very counterproductive. Is this relating to the volume of traffic which passes through?
It relates to the volume of traffic, but also the fact that you need the air to move away from the vulnerable people. So basically, the canopy is acting as a bit of a roof system. It's not dispersing the air. So we are moving to the idea that when you've got very busy roads, the sort of Regent Street type sort of scenario, you would think of columnar trees or other interventions such as green walls or even sometimes green roofs. So it is the geometry in some ways as well as the biology that affects it. But you can imagine if you've got a double-decker bus and lorries going along a road and those exhausts are just coming out and staying there, they're not dispersing because of a canopy of trees above it. That's difficult.
With the columnar type trees, we can't assume that every tree has the same value in terms of air quality. So is there then particular types of trees, types of columnar trees? Because I'm assuming we want foliage kind of from the base to obviously to the top. But then are we looking for more of that ruffled foliage? Are we looking for a waxy coating? Is there a particular type of foliage we look for particulates?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I think the pragmatic answer to this is a bit of variety. So you let's say, for example, you had Paris Chanticleer, which is fairly columnar in its growth habit. It does have quite a nice waxy leaf, so I suspect it's going to attract some of the larger PM particles. But it might also be that we have something like a cupressus or a tamarisk or something else as a fine filter, which maybe is absorbing something slightly smaller. But what we're learning from the research is that sort of complementary plant groupings seem to be best rather than just it's A or B, because you've got this dynamic, this matrix of pollutants, but also different levels of biological interaction. And so I think generally speaking, having plants we know that are good, but then mixing them together probably provides the best solution.
Yeah, that's really good to know. And now we have particulates present in the air. We're installing the best types of foliage. We're putting different variations of those plant species. But again, I read from your book that actually exposed soil can actually be quite beneficial in terms of particulate matter as well, due to microorganisms which exist in the soil. So will this actually play the same in a living wall scenario? Will we have the same microorganisms? And what happens when those particulates make physical contact with the soil behind?
I think the key there is to some extent how much the roots are exposed to the atmosphere. So, and that will depend a little bit on the substrate you might be using in a green wall. In time, everything will build up its own biological system. So even if it was rock wool, you would get sort of microbial communities building up around the root zone, and many of them will be, I think, beneficial at breaking down some of the materials that are in the air. So there's two aspects here. The soil acts as an extra trap. So if you can imagine in a tree situation, the particulate is caught on the leaf, then rains, and then it runs down into the soil, and then it's held in the soil and it's deactivated to some extent by the microbial communities there. In a green wall situation, we want to make sure the same sort of process happens, that you have a biologically rich microflora both on the plant, and most plants are covered with microbes, but also in that root phase, and making sure that things like rainwater gets into the root system if we can, because that's where the particulates will run off. And I suspect they will be broken down and made more inert in that process.
Okay, and this is a question I've been asked several times, and I try to put everyone's mind at ease. And that question always came about, let's say we install all the best plants for trapping particulates. We put in our statues and our various geraniums and whatnot. I think the perception from people was that there's a huge accumulation of these particulates, and if we brushed off, there's a big puff of dust back into the air. Like, I'm surely that wouldn't happen. But when these particulates are on the leaf, like, what is the next step? Is it rainfall, or how are these particulates dealt with?
Well, I think it's 3 points. One, they can physically run off as rainfall and rainwater. There is some concern that when you have a rain splash, that some of the stuff is put back into the air. But generally speaking, I think if it's running off and it's into the soil, then the complexity of the soil holds it. But you're also talking about deactivation. So if it's the particulate matter, remember some of these things are hydrocarbons in some form or another. So it may well be that the microbial community can basically digest them or absorb them in a way. So just having more biological activity, microbes on the leaf, but also this what we call the rhizosphere, all this very rich microbial interactions that happen around a plant root. There will be a degree of deactivation of the smuts and the particular matters. The one that's more difficult is heavy metals. So if you're ever dealing with heavy metals, they never really disappear from the system, but they can be what's called chelated. They can be held and therefore less available to the atmosphere, less exposure to people. But that's a slightly different topic today, because many of the heavy metals are obviously not that mobile in the air.
Okay, that's, you know what, as we learn more, you know, when I studied horticulture back in 2008, this was never a topic. It was never that we discussed about air pollution and we discussed about particulate matter and all these little microbes. So now we look at horticulture as it stands today. Now, unfortunately, there does seem to be a decline in horticulture. I know in 2000, last year in 2020, 7 people had joined the course here in London, 4 people had finished.
Right.
But now, like, to train the next level of horticulture, should we start to take more of a scientific approach? Because as more studies such as yourselves become available, and us as the greater audience starts to learn a little bit more, we suddenly realize that there's a whole vast section of information which is missing. Because in hort school, we learn how to prune the plants, we learn plant identification, we learn pests and diseases. But now it almost seems there has to be like an urban horticultural course. Is this something you've come across, or is this something that you're teaching your? I know your students are at PhD level, and probably not partner level.
Yeah. We teach landscape architects, which is slightly different route in, but they do have to understand the biology of the plant and the systems. I think the horticulture one's quite difficult. I think courses do expand and contract. I've been an external examiner after 2 or 3 over the last few years, and I've actually been quite impressed by both the numbers of students to some extent in the courses I've been involved with, but also them being very contemporary and understanding the science and the literature. So I was examining our Eden project, for example, recently, and they were very up to speed on some of these principles. Now, they may not all end up in practical horticulture, but I think that will filter through. Some of these things will filter through in time. So yeah, I think some courses do have this stuff on the curriculum, and it's also hidden away in courses we wouldn't call horticulture. So, you know, some of the environmental science courses, even things like urban planning, there'll be an understanding of you know, the green infrastructure and the potential, if not down to the individual details that you and I are interested in.
Yeah. Now, let's say we talk about the practicalities of installing a living wall, but still having that as a viable option, you know, to help affect air pollution. So do we have to consider head height, where that vegetation is placed? Is once we install above a certain height, is it almost irrelevant, or does it affect us? Does it affect us having foliage or being surrounded by foliage, especially where we breathe in? Will that have a positive effect in terms of air quality?
Yeah, I think there's 2 elements to this. So that scrubbing effect of the vegetation, it's very important that is actually at head height, because that's where we're breathing in these particulates and sulfur dioxides and things. So I think the idea of green hedges, green walls, and even green roofs, there's some evidence that, you know, as you get these plumes of air columns in the city, that the green roof can also act as a filter, even though it's many, many meters away from the streetscape. So there's an element of the filtering effect being useful everywhere we can. At the same time, recently research has suggested that plants, and particularly soil, are giving off beneficial materials. They give off beneficial chemicals, what we call phytonicides, but also they have their own rich microbial communities that we think affect our health directly. So this is the positive side of the equation. This isn't poor air quality, this is air quality that actually improves our health directly. And that seems to be most beneficial when you've got a most natural environment. So lots of different plant materials, lots of different microbial organisms. And this is really the sort of foundation of what they call the forest bathing idea, that you're breathing in certain biochemical materials and certain microbes that basically interact with our own physiology, stimulate our immune system, and we also think they actually interact with our hormonal regulation. So this, what they call the brain-gut axis. And so we're breathing in some of these beneficials, and it's actually affecting hormone levels that then seem to have positive effects on things like mental health. So it's all about trying to show that we're part of the natural world and dependent on these interactions with plants and other organisms, not separate from it. And that challenges our whole concept about having a hygienic environment, because what is actually hygienic for us may not be just completely sterile.
Now, that's really interesting, because I think lots of people are aware or may have heard it in the ether that, when we're exposed to nature, it helps with our mental health. But now, obviously, with this information here, it's shown having a direct effect to our physical health as well. And you mentioned forest bathing, Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing in Japanese. Like, this has been a part of the Japanese National Health Service for the last 40 years. And it should be, and it was so successful that South Korea have also adopted their version. Do you ever think this process will come to the UK? Will there ever be a time when a UK doctor will be prescribing a walk in the forest, a walk in the park?
Well, they do already. So it's coming. Our assumption has been it's been psychological. This is a quiet, relaxing place. You can, chill out. You can forget the problems to some extent. We've always assumed that was a purely psychological process. However, the whole phytonicide microbiome interactions may suggest that there's actually a biochemical relationship to it. We're not just our own brain, it's the fact that our body is interacting with the natural environment. And ultimately, when we talk about food, it's no surprise that we're dependent on plants and animals as a source of nutrition. And it seems to be the same case in terms of topping up our own microbiome.
Yeah, because, like today, 50% of the world's population live in a town or a city, and they reckon by 2050 that will increase to 70%. There's a drive for people to live in a town or a city. But was that going to jeopardize space? Because, private space, a private garden or even a semi-private garden is almost a luxury these days, and they're ever decreasing within size. We understand immersing yourself within the landscape is tremendously important for physical and mental health. So where does that leave us in the future? Does that just leave a bigger opening then for green infrastructure? Because I'm all for the cities in plants, but is it the same as immersing yourself within the forest? Great to hear your opinion.
The jury's out. We don't know yet, and that's one of the sort of pioneering areas of research. Is just how rich and how complex do these biological communities need to be to kind of optimize the benefit. And I think it's a gradient. I think, to be honest, having some greenery near you gives you a bit of a benefit, but the more complex that can be, then the better the benefit is. But it also looks to us as almost like green engineers. Where can we put the plants? Can we put them on lampposts? Can we put them between the building and the pavement? Let's see where we can bang in green space where it doesn't interrupt too much of the functioning of the city. Maybe we should have green drains more often. The process of water coming off the building is purified and used as a place for planting material. So all these things are in for the discussion, but I think the general principle that we want to get the urban person engaged with nature as much as possible, seems to be the evidence for that being important seems to be increasing.
Well, I suppose now we have, I know in London, in Southampton, in Swansea, we have the urban greening factor. And I think Manchester is coming next, and it probably won't take too long to percolate across the country. Biodiversity net gain becoming law, this November. I think it's November the 11th. They've given us a date. So surely with these two big government entities, they're going to be able to, we should see more green infrastructure, on their streets. It will give people more exposure than what they're used to. Because we are, as part of biodiversity net gain, we're looking at all the different classifications. So the woodland planting, the heaths, the mires, the grasslands, the wetlands. We're running trials on all of these. Now this is ultimately for biodiversity net gain, and we want to be able to say to an ecologist, you can pick your classification. We have approved evergreen species which will operate. But we obviously want to go one step further. We would love to be able to include planting which is known for, i.e., it's great for removing carbon, nitric oxide, particulate matter, as well as produces pollen, nectar, fruits, berries, structural planting for nesting opportunities, etc. So there's always that challenge for us as providers then to look one step ahead and see what we can bring in for that whole kind of green envelope. But you as an academic, where you would speak with your students, you speak with government, and then you would speak with suppliers such as yourself, contractors. What would you like to see? If you had your magic wand and you could make any changes to the environment or people's perceptions, or what would that be?
Interesting question. I think there's various questions. One, of course, is climate change, and I'd like to see that dismissed off the table completely, that we've got on top of that, because that threatens us, but it also threatens some of our abilities to deal with climate change, because obviously we need for plants to be functional in the city, they need water, they need the temperatures not to be too excessive, etc. But I think in general that more philosophical point is that people appreciate and enjoy the green space and then value it, because I think one of the issues we have, so many of the problems at the minute, is that this disconnection, this sort of myopia we have towards the natural world, it isn't really an option. We're actually really dependent on it. So the more people can realize that, can see plants, can see the butterflies, can appreciate it, I think is a real counterbalance to this very fast moving urban world where we're on our phones all the time, we're on our computers all the time. But I think, for argument's sake, just even in mental health, having that better balance between the high tech and the natural world would be really useful.
Yeah, I was in Manchester, in Salford and Manchester, a couple of weeks ago, actually with this living wall behind us. But I was in the building next door looking at this building, and it was a real juxtaposition. I was looking, I could see the kitchen, I could see the sink, I could see the tables and chairs, and outside was this block of greenery. And the reason I bring this up is I read a document many years ago, and it says that once people live above the third floor of a building, they start to have a disconnect to the land down below. It doesn't become, they don't feel a part of that land because they're too high in the air. I just thought it was so unusual that I was 10 floors up and I was just looking at this block of greenery, and you could see the birds fly into the foliage, you could make nests. It kind of brings that connection back. So maybe in the future, when we see these bigger buildings being covered, it will maybe revisit that connection within people, that they can actually call this home. And this is what we're here for. I'm from the countryside, and for me it's quite easy to have that connection with nature. I feel it as normal. But I've spoken to many people within the built environment who rarely have left the city, and they have no love for nature. They have no connection, and they don't see themselves as an element of nature, because we're the biggest element of nature we know, and we make a connection to the land. I think it's very tragic to see when people lose that connection completely. Hopefully we can revisit that again. I think we've covered enough for today on the topic of air quality. I want to thank you so much for joining me today, Ross.
No problem.
You have a book out. Is there any shameless self-promotion you would like to do?
Well, only there's one book which the professionals might find useful, which is called Environmental Horticulture, which is the science and management of green spaces. So I think there's another edition due in the next sort of 18 months or so. So that helps give a balance between traditional horticulture views and the values of these green spaces to us as a society. So it's making that link really about the real economic and social value around plants.
Yeah.
And then there's another book about health and well-being, but we don't need to dwell on that one.
I haven't got that book yet, Ross, but I do have your environmental horticulture. And if anyone is there who wants to learn more about various fascinating studies, I'd urge you strongly to purchase that book. It can be purchased on Amazon. That's where I got my copy. But Ross, thank you so much for joining me today. And I believe
it's been a pleasure.
And we will speak soon for another webinar on the topic of thermal properties within the built environment. So thank you so much for today, Ross.
Thanks, Dan. Cheers.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for joining me on today's webinar. I really do hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or queries, please feel free to either email me, niall.mcavoy@ans.global, or you can visit our website, our LinkedIn page. If you leave a message, someone will reply to you very shortly. Thank you.